Okay, welcome everybody. This is going to be my third installment of Drinking with Authors, where we chat with different authors about their most recent book, about writing, and most importantly, about what they are drinking. So hopefully everybody will get to meet Marshall Ryan Maresca here, and from there get to into his books. He's got plenty of books out there. Today, though, we're going to talk mostly about his newest one, The Velocity of Revolution, okay, which I just finished literally this morning. And so I'm sure I have thoughts about it that haven't materialized just yet, but I love the book. Hopefully some of you guys will go check it out, like maybe right now, order it right now. And hopefully other people will enjoy it as well, because I thought it was a very cool book. I thought there was a very unique setting, unique storyline, and one of the things we'll have to talk about is how completely different this one is from your Meridane series. So I'm probably mispronouncing a bunch of the words here for your series and whatnot, but correct me if I do along the way. But we're going to start with what you are drinking at the moment. So explain what you're drinking. I'm sure it's something very interesting.
So right now, because it is 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, I couldn't go too crazy. I've got Topo Chico with hibiscus and lime both. So it's, you know.
Oh, cool. That's very cool.
So
does it have a special name, or is it your own concoction?
It's my own concoction. I mean, we typically in my household we're making hibiscus tea, or agua de Jamaica, as it's usually called here in our household. And usually when we make it in a concentrated batch and then water it down. I said, why not, instead mix with Topo Chico? So it has a little bit of it. At least a little bit of fizz if I'm not going to have a little bit of kick, because as I said, it is 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and I have to be at least a little responsible.
Just a touch.
Just a touch.
I had the exact same thought when I said, okay, what am I going to drink? And then I was like, wait, it's only 3. I probably shouldn't go all out. But I did mix myself a little drink. It's nothing fancy, though. It's just basically ginger ale with vodka. So ginger with vodka, but I'm kicking it up a notch because I'm using a bold ginger ale, which is supposed to be like much more intense than regular ginger ale. And yes, there is certainly a more ginger flavor going on here. So yes, that's what I'm drinking. A little vodka, like you said. It's a little early for anything more serious.
So it's close to a Moscow Mule, but not quite there yet.
Yes, not quite there, and I don't have a copper cup, so.
Precisely. We will mix something here that we call a Mexican Mule, where we use ginger beer and tequila and lime, and that's really good. So.
Sounds good, because I'm a fan of mules in general. I order them often when we're out and about. So let's switch over to The Velocity of Revolution. Why don't you give us your rundown of what The Velocity of Revolution is all about? And I mean, it's your book, so you can give away spoilers if you want, but usually we try to go spoiler-free.
Okay. It's funny because, like, we've been, in quarantine pandemic times since both the run-up to this book coming out and since the book has come out. I never really, solidified that, here's my 30-second pitch. Like, somebody on another interview I did, it's like, so what's your elevator pitch for this book? And I'm like, I haven't been in an elevator in a year and a half. I didn't even think about that.
No, it's true. I run into it with my own anthologies that are coming out. It's like, we're not at a con. We don't have to have that patter down.
You don't have to, yeah. And so that's been a thing I've been needing to solidify back in my brain. What is the quick 30-second pitch for this book? So it is set in a world in a country that has been the center of a war and has been colonized and occupied several times, and so this is a terrible pitch. The quick pitch of it is it's a secondary world diesel punk fantasy with magic mushrooms and motorcycles, and it's sort of Fast and the Furious meets Jesus Christ Superstar. Like that's
that's definitely an elevator pitch.
There's the elevator pitch. So it's about this world where there is this revolution brewing that's run by the motorcycle gangs in the outskirts of the city where the poorer casts live. And then this one motorcycle cop who gets recruited to go undercover, but because the gangs are using, the resistance cells are using this magical mushroom, which is supposed to be banned, but they use it because it lets them interconnect with each other and know what each other are feeling and know what each other are experiencing. So it's been impossible to get a undercover infiltrator into the gangs, but he has a strange ability to actually be invisible to them so that they then connect him with the one person that they've actually captured from the gangs to be able to like sneak him past what the magic mushroom does. So then he's able to infiltrate the gangs and hopefully take down their revolution. But in being in there, he learns more and more about what's really going on in this culture. So.
Yes. So yes, that's a good summary. I think the key words coming out of that though are it's a fantasy with motorcycles and magic mushrooms. I think that's
yes.
the second pitch there. Fantasy of motorcycles and magic mushrooms, which I thought was really cool. That leads into a writerly question, but I want to save that one for later. I want to talk a little bit more about world building here first, because this is not set in your Meridain where you've lived for 12 books so far, 12 published books so far anyway. So it's not in that Meridain universe. And which means, as you note in your afterword, it means that you had to do like all new world building and all new, magic system building and all that kind of stuff. So, and you can also bring up your, is it a podcast? Your podcast as well. So talk to me about the world building here, and then because one of the things that I think is really, really cool about this book, or at least really like latched into my brain in particular, is the setting. You've got a really, really strong Mesoamerican feel to the setting, and which I love. I've been in love with like Aztecs and Mayas and Olmec and all that kind of stuff for ages. So it really latched into my brain. So talk to me about all of that, how all that came about, and why it ended up with the Mesoamerican flavor to it.
So it started originally. I was in a shop with my son where he was buying a pair of raw denim jeans, and there was just this gorgeous vintage motorcycle just like on display in the middle of the shop for whatever reasons, for purely aesthetic reasons, and he was just like, hey, why is it that fantasy novels, they're all like Renaissance fair kind of, Lord of the Rings-esque settings, and it's like, why aren't there ones that, look like this? And why are they like always eating like roasted turkey legs and nobody eats tacos? Like, shouldn't there be fantasy books with motorcycles and tacos? And I was like, yes, there definitely should be. And so that was the spark that first kicked in there. And so I live in Austin, Texas, and my wife grew up in Mexico City. So, and we run a business together where she teaches Spanish to children and adults. And we are, Mexican culture has been something that's been just an infused part of my life for the past 21 years of my marriage. It's my anniversary today, by the way.
Oh, anniversary.
Yeah. So
sorry, I'm taking you away from all that.
I'm teaching right now, so this was the perfect time. So adding, since I've been immersed in Mexican culture for all this time, I thought, if I'm going to do something that's just not a standard, Western European medieval kind of setting, then what's the kind of setting that I'm intimately familiar enough with that I can create something that feels honest and true and has something real to it. And so having that Mesoamerican culture, having, especially a post-colonized Mexico culture as a formative base for this book just made perfect sense to me. And so it then very much became a book about, in the world building process, writing about a place that has gone through colonization and the impact that would have on such a place. And so I have a podcast called Worldbuilding for Masochists that I do with Rowena Miller and Cass Morris. And when I first, conceived of this book and commissioned it was right around the time when we first started doing the podcast. And one of the main things we talk about on that podcast, the phrase we use is choose versus presume, where a lot of times in fantasy world building, there's just a lot of base presumptions that people make and they never question them, instead of making active choices about why certain elements are in the world that they're building. Now, and you can still do, I think, a traditional, like Western European medieval type of fantasy world, but even when you're doing that, you should be interrogating, like, why am I having this? Why do I have like a standard royalty and other Western European nobility titles? What am I trying to achieve with that? What am I trying to say with that? So with this world, in being so different, every time I started to think like, okay, I'm just going to do this, and I said to myself, okay, why are you making that choice? Is that a choice you're actually making, or do you just make a presumption? So it was this constant process of examining the choices I was making within the world and how that would work and how they played out.
And so do you feel that this world is better developed than your Meridain because you started doing this recently, or like, do you feel like you have improved? And like, do you look back at Meridain now and say, I wished I'd done this or that or the other thing?
Well, with Meridain, that was a very long process. The initial world building process for that started back in 1993 and was reworked and fine-tuned over time. So this was a faster process, and certainly I have become better at that aspect of the craft, I think. And so I don't want to say necessarily like it's more in depth or less in depth, or necessarily compare the two in terms of on a qualitative measure. Certainly, I did this one in a faster way and focused primarily on the elements that were most important for the story. Like, there's stuff happening on the other side of the world. I'm like, it's just stuff happens on the other side of the world, and that doesn't matter for this story at all. But so, I mean, I would say it's a different process that I was just coming at from a different way and had to be done faster, but was also done with more knowledge of where I was starting from in the first place. So Meridain was a long process of finding my way through it and figuring out, oh, I don't have to do it this way. I can make a choice to do it this way, and that's fine. Whereas here, I understood that process better from the get-go.
Okay. And now, do I want to talk about that? One of the things that you've said, and I noticed this in the afterword, and you've said it multiple times here, and I've been saying it because I read your afterword and whatnot, but you keep calling this book a fantasy book. And, yeah. And when I picked it up and started reading it, I mean, I don't even know if it says, no, it doesn't say on the side of the book. I
Did they do that one?
like no preconceptions. All I knew was that, oh, this is Maresca, and this looks really cool, and it's not set in Meridain because I'm halfway through Meridain, but I'm not finished with Meridain, so I can't continue on Meridain until I finish the other books in it. But I said, oh, this is something I can pick up that's recent, and it's a book all by itself. It's not connected to all of your previous books. So when I picked it up and started it, I had no preconceptions of the book whatsoever. And I was probably a third, maybe even a half of the way through it when I caught the afterword reference to it being a fantasy. And I sat back and I said, huh, it's interesting that you're thinking of it as a fantasy, because my conception of the book up until that point was that it was science fiction. I was reading it as if it were a science fiction book. Because, I mean, probably the base of that was just that you had motorcycles in it, right? So you don't associate motorcycles with fantasy. But after I read that you were thinking of it as a fantasy, I started looking at it and saying, okay, why is it that you are thinking of it as a fantasy? So can you answer that question for me? Why do you think of this as fantasy as opposed to science fiction?
I mean, partly because it is driven by, the plot is driven by a specific form of magic, which I think automatically makes it fantasy. And also, it is a secondary world. I think one of the things I am thrilled that we've been seeing over the past few years in fantasy publishing is we've really been seeing a strong interrogation of what fantasy needs to look like. Like I've been said before, the presumed model is one of this like Western European medieval to Renaissance type things. And that really never got pushed against too hard in secondary world fantasy. Like you would have like urban fantasy that's like set here in this world, but then there's magic or fairies or other things superimposed on the real world. But you rarely saw anything in secondary world fantasy that challenged that Western European model, or if it did, it just picked a different part of the world to model. Like you would see a few that instead of Western Europe would be Eastern Europe or the Middle East or Asia or something like that, but not too much. That it's certainly not that strayed from that on a technological level. And in the past, I want to say decade, we've been seeing more and more push on that. We saw more push towards first just a little closer towards industrialization with a lot of flintlock fantasy, and then you had things like Max Gladstone's Craft sequence, which is very much in just sort of like a modern world, but it is a secondary world fantasy, just one that is like late 20th century, early 21st century in terms of its technology. Andalee's Green Bone Saga is another one that's set in something that feels somewhere between 1920s and 1950s. And so I was intrigued to do something of the same thing, of throw away all those preconceptions of what fantasy is and make something unique. And I've been saying diesel punk because I think that at least gets people in the right frame of mind of what to expect. But certainly I can see how it feels more science fictional in reading just because it is technological, and the technology and the magic not only blend together, but are used in tandem rather than being these two separate things. Because that's the thing you find very common, the idea that the magical world and the technological world need to stay separate. Like how in the Harry Potter books, all the magical world, they're still like, oh no, we got to use quills with inks. And, everything is still very 19th century in the magical world for no reason other than because it's the magical world. We don't advance past that.
Yeah. So when you say the magic in your world, you're referring to the mushrooms?
Yes.
You're thinking of the mushrooms as being your magic system?
Yes.
Okay, because I wasn't thinking of that while I was reading. I wasn't thinking of that until I saw your reference to it being a fantasy, and then I went back to it, like I said, and started looking at it from that perspective. And I said, okay, I decided that you were treating the mushrooms as your magic system, and I can see that from that perspective. But before that, I was thinking of the mushrooms as still being just a scientific thing, that that was going to be the quote unquote base of your technology. Now that I've read the ending, remember that was like a third of the way through or half of the way through. And so the mushrooms had played a part, but they hadn't become, I wouldn't say a horrendously significant part yet by that point. So by the end, I was like, okay, but the book, I was like, okay, yeah, you are treating the mushrooms as a magic system, and not necessarily, you weren't treating them scientifically necessarily by the end. So after the fact, I was like, okay, I can see why this is shaped as a fantasy. And I totally agree with what you were saying before, that there has been a trend toward less traditional fantasy settings, I guess you would say. I mean, even my own books have been headed in that direction. My Lay series, I think of as being a quote unquote modern fantasy, but it's set in it's a secondary world. And my newest series, the DAW is going to start publishing next year, that one's even farther down that road than the Lay series was. So I like this trend of the fantasy having sort of some science fictional aspects to it in some sense, like this blending. It's kind of a blending of science fiction and fantasy, because I still think of all of mine as fantasies. I am writing them as fantasies, and not from the science fiction headspace, so to speak. So since this obviously, and you obviously spent a lot of time with world building on the Meridane series, so talk to us a little bit more craft-wise about how you go about your world building for like this book in particular, but also your Meridane.
So with this one, it certainly started from a process of like having that big concept and then building out from that. So one of the things I always try and do is I can't just build one place at once, because I feel like everyone is influenced by your neighbors and with that comes the history. So I always need to start with the basis of having a map, getting a rough idea of who is who within the world, and then what's happened up until now, both in a big picture sense and in a small picture sense. And with this one, I did something that I had never done before in world building, where, and especially in terms of figuring out the recent history, because at the time I was working this part out, it was one of those moments where on Twitter there was a lot of conversations about like baby boomers are this and Gen X is like this and millennials are this. And I thought, not too often in fantasy do you see a real sense of what the generational divide between people are in that world. And a lot of times in traditional fantasy, there is almost a sense that the world has been static, that for your main characters and their grandparents, the world was more or less the same, and they grew up the same way. And so part of what I was striving for with this was getting rid of that sense of preconception. So I actually worked out what the generational divides would be based on the things that would happen, and how each of my characters, based on when they were born, would have a very different generational perspective than the people younger than them or the people older than them, because they went through different things.
Yeah, Yeah. So I don't know if you noticed, I showed a picture of the maps that are some of the maps that are at the beginning of the books. So are those your maps? Like you draw those up first and then develop them from there? That's what it sounds like. Yeah. And then how, so this is before you even start writing anything. How
pretty much, yeah.
You like write out a like history of the world and things that happened, anything like that?
In this one, I actually didn't do too detailed of a history past really beyond, say, the lifetimes of the characters who are in this story. Like I did some strong work of what like the last 70 years or so were, but before that I didn't do that deep dive into further back because I didn't think it necessarily played a strong part in the story I was telling for this. And I did curb my instincts to sort of go overboard with that sort of thing because I was like, that's really not going to be too useful in terms of what I need for this particular story. Because
I mean, you got in a lot of history because you've got like 2 transoceanic wars, and you
right.
You know, the city's been bombed out, and I mean there was a lot of history that you got across in you know, it's a 350-page book. That's pretty tiny for a fantasy, and and yet you still got a lot across.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was an exercise in how can I do the most with the most economical usage of terms and words without and trying to avoid as much like sort of just here's a bunch of backstory, here's a bunch of like trying to avoid those sort of expositional dumps. And one of the things I have learned over the course of first writing the Meridian books and then I put further into application here is respecting my audience enough to say I don't need to explain these things to them. Like, understand, you know, there is that urge of like, I have done all this world building work and now I'm going to give it all to you. And I think it's a stronger choice to hold back and only give the bits that really matter to the story and that make the story grow rather than make the story stop.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I mean, that's you have the same editor as I do, Sheila Gilbert, and what the main comment I usually get during the editing phase from Sheila is she wants to see more. She wants to see more of the world and more, you know, she wants to see everything that's going on behind the scenes. And at least with me, it's always been a balancing act because, like you know, if it doesn't pertain to the story, I've kind of left it out because I'm like, okay, the reader doesn't need to know that. And so it's always a battle between me and Sheila about, you know, how much I'm going to actually end up putting in there about the world and the history and the backstory and all that kind of stuff. So do you find the same thing going on with you and Sheila?
I wouldn't call it a battle, but it is a great tool for me to then, when she says, oh, you can tell us more about that, then that's the thing that gives me, it's like, okay, actually more about that is what's important to the story because that didn't come clear enough. So that is a great lens for me to view what I thought made perfect sense because it was presumed in my head, as opposed to the things that really didn't need further explanation because they didn't further the story. So that's always been a very helpful tool for me, of her reactions of like, this is something you can explain a little more.
Well, yes, I mean, that's always the case. Because if she's bringing it up, then you have to ask yourself, okay, what didn't get across? What didn't
exactly?
What didn't become clear? So yeah, it's always interesting, the conversations with Sheila, but she does tend to want more. In the end. and my editor, or not my editor, my agent is more or less the same. He's usually also telling me, you know, we need to have a little more here, a little more here, you know, build this up a little more, which is unusual because my agent is usually the reverse. He's usually telling everybody to cut. But he said with me, it's always, you know, you need to add a little more here and a little more here. And like you said, it's typically an assumption on my part that something has gotten across to the reader, or it's in my head, but I didn't put it down on the paper, kind of thing. And so yeah, all of that is very helpful in the long run on revisions. But I called it a battle because I'm resistant. I don't want to, I call it bloat. I don't want any bloat in my books where, you know, you're reading 5 pages and you're like, nothing is advanced because it's all world building stuff. And
Right.
I'm very, very shy of that. So it's a little bit of a battle because they want it and say I need it, and I have to convince myself that, you know, that it's not bloat and that they're right.
No, I get it. I'm very gun shy about that as well, though I do think it's an easier process to know more about this, about all the world building stuff. When the question is, well, what is that? Can you expand on that? Be able to be like, yes, as a matter of fact, I can, and then weave that through there. Than to have too much and be like, oh, I've got to boil this down now. How do I do that? That strikes me as a much harder thing to do in an editing process than to add more to clarify.
I would agree. I'd much
at least that's my style. No, other people are.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'd much rather be adding something than trying to figure out what to take out. And because, you know, if you take something out, my stuff tends to be connected enough that if I take something out, it's going to destroy something else later on, and that I haven't figured out yet until I get there. And then I'll be like, oh crap, I cut that earlier, which means I can't do this here, you know, and it usually creates more problems cutting than adding. But that brings up a question I should have asked earlier, but I think I already know the answer. How would you describe yourself as a writer? Are you the plotter? Do you outline everything and write, you know, the 30-page distillation and then start writing, or what?
So I'm a big outliner.
Wow.
Yeah, I need to figure out everything about where I am and where I'm going before I can even really get started with the writing process of actual text. For me, it's the equivalent of, like, if you're going to do a road trip across the country, I need to, like, get out a map and be like, okay, we're going to be able to drive this far on the first day, this far on the second day, and we'll stop here, and we'll get a hotel here, and then, you know, by the third day we'll reach our destination. And so I have that plan. Then the actual writing process is the actual drive, where, oh, it looks like we, you know, like we're gonna pull over in this way because, you know, there's a traffic accident here and we need to go around this way, or, oh, we blew a tire and we're gonna have to stop for a while, and so we're not gonna make it to where we expected to make it by the end of the day, so we're sleeping somewhere else than we had originally planned. And the actual process of going through that is a process of discovery still, even if you have a general plan that you're going by in the process.
I'm the exact opposite. I don't really have anything written out ahead of time. I just sit down and start writing, and even by the end of the book, I have this little notebook I keep by the computer, and I write things in it as they come up. So, you know, if a new character pops up, I'll write down his name, and then if I, you know, mention the eye color or the hair color, you know, something like that, I'll write that down in my little notebook. But even at the end of, you know, a 400-page book, I probably only filled up 4 pages of notebook with notes, and it's funny that you used a road trip as your analogy, because I co-edit a lot of anthologies with my friend Patricia Bray, and she actually said one time when we were getting ready to head to a convention, she said, she's like you. She will plot everything out. She'll get like 3 different routes to get to the hotel ahead of time. And I'm like, I get in the car and say, where are we going? I don't have a road map. I just know we're headed to Boston. And I'm like, we got to get this road to get started to Boston. And then I head out and I worry about the details later. And so it's funny that you brought the road trip analogy into it, just because of that. So let's talk a little bit about your big project, because before we get into the big project, I gotta know,
Okay.
Is this a standalone, or are you planning anything else beyond this in this world?
I, at this time, do not have a specific idea for what a sequel would look like. I'm not going to say it's impossible, because if I were to do anything, like the concept that appeals to me the most, if I were to do something, would be to jump ahead a generation and look at where things are, 25 years later, rather than something that picks up immediately afterwards, anything like that. I think that would be a far more interesting thing to do. But other than that vague idea, I don't have anything specific planned, and certainly don't have anything outlined. I wrote it with the intention of it being a standalone, and the idea of a sequel sparks me, then I will go with that. But
yeah, I was gonna say it reads as a standalone. I mean, like when you finish the book, it's okay, yeah, that story's done. There doesn't have to be anything more after it. I just, as a writer, when I finished it, I was like, okay, if I were going to write a sequel to this, what would the sequel be about? And so I have an idea of what I would do if I were to write a sequel to this. But even just what you said there, your whole vague, me being the writer, that vague idea of what you would do is like a whole trilogy.
Yeah.
Like, I already know that's going to be a whole trilogy, all by itself. But that's just the way I write. So but yes, it reads as a standalone. I was not expecting you to say, there's book 2 is coming out next year, or anything along those lines. And this is certainly, you mentioned in the afterwards, this is your break. You took this as a break from Meridain because you just your big 12-book experiment, so to speak. So talk to us a little bit about Meridain, because your next book, which is supposed to come out this fall, continues Meridain, right?
Yes, indirectly. So the 12 books that I have so far of the Meridain Saga. So what that is actually 4 series that are. The Meridain Saga is a single series that are 4 series that are intertwined fantasy novels about all the different heroes from different levels of the society, from the streets to the palaces, who are fighting their good fight in their way of all the crime and corruption and conspiracies that are happening within Meridain. So, and with each of the sub-series, I'm sort of looking at this city from a different angle and sort of grafting a different kind of subgenre on them with each one. So with the Thorn series, which starts with Thorn of Denton Hill and then Alchemy of Chaos and Impostors of Avondale, those I'm grafting the element of superhero fiction and comic books onto the fantasy world. And then with the Meridain Constabulary, which starts with a murder of mages and then an import of intrigue and a parliament of bodies, those are police procedurals. And then the Streets of Meridain series, which starts with the Whole Valley Crew, and then Lady Henderman's Wardrobe, and then the Fenmere Job, are all heist books, essentially. And then the Meridain Elite, which starts with The Way of the Shield, and then Shields of the People and People of the City, are political thrillers, though as each series goes on, those interconnections become stronger and stronger. So, for example, Imposters of Avontil has the Meridian Constabulary characters show up within the Thorns world, so that's also the elements of their kind of story weaves into the Thorn stories. And same thing with having the elite characters showing up in Parliament of Bodies, having the Thorn characters show up in the Fenimore Shop, and then with People of the City, it's actually all of the characters from all the main characters from all 4 of the series all coming together in a very Avengers-like sequence. That was so much fun to write. It was incredible. So, and then that caps off what I've been calling phase 1 of the Meridian Saga. And so the book I have coming out, which is called An Unintended Voyage, is set in the same world, but it is on the other side of the world in a completely different city. So it's kind of hard to talk about this book without delving into some of the spoilers, at least. But
it's up to you how deep you want to go.
Right. So
then that's fine.
Roughly, at the end of A Parliament of Bodies, one of our characters ends up on a boat that they never planned to be on, that is taking them well outside of Meridian. And so, and it's one of the constabulary characters. So when I initially conceived this, we pitched the title as A Constabulary of One. But over the course of writing it, like, that title became more and more incorrect.
One of my questions is going to be about the name change, because when I pre-ordered the book, it was called The Constabulary of One.
Right.
And then I got a notice a little while ago that or actually I think it was on your Facebook page, you posted that the cover reveal, and it was this Unexpected Journey title now. So.
Right. And so, and that was so much because just the process of writing it was a title that I was always like, okay, it felt like a placeholder title when we first came up with it. And over the course of writing the book, it just felt more and more incorrect, because it evokes the kind of story that is sort of like, this lone cop who has to, fight up against the system and fight all these people, and they've got nobody at their back. Whereas the story is so much about Corey finding her people and finding this found family in this new place, and becoming part of a community because of that. So therefore, that title just felt more and more incorrect, and so I knew that was the thing that we had to change.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions: is why did the title change, or how did the title change? And so when is that coming out?
It is scheduled for November 2nd. So.
Okay. But as everybody probably picked up on, it's up for pre-order now, because I've already pre-ordered.
Yes.
Okay, and are you thinking of this Unexpected Journey as the first book in a new phase, new 12 phase? Has it been planned out that?
So I've got a plan for phase 2 of Meridian, and where this book fit in all that was kind of I couldn't quite figure that out for a while, because it's connected to where things are going in phase 2, but also very disconnected in other ways. So I've been taking to calling it the prelude to phase 2 of the Meridian Saga. And I'm still keeping a lot of what phase 2 is going to be under my hat at this time.
Yeah. Well, that's understandable.
But the rough idea is we're going to see 2 more books of each of the 4 series that will continue the process of everyone's story being tying closer and closer together, but also putting some buttons on people's individual plot lines as the larger story of what's going on in the background of the city becomes more and more clear. That's my that's my trying not to be spoilery big picture concept there.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard after 12 books to try to say what's gonna happen next without spoiling something in the 12 books. I mean, it's hard in a trilogy, and you have to talk about book 3, and you're like, oh, I don't want to spoil any book 1 for the people that haven't even read it yet. And so yeah, it's I understand the trouble there. Okay, so why don't you tell us where people can find you online, and we'll go from there.
Okay. My webpage is MarshallRyanMarescaDrinkingWithAuthors.com. You can find me. No, it's not. My webpage is MRMaresca.com. You can find me on Twitter as @MarshallRyanMaresca. You can also find my podcast at WorldbuildCast, and we are World Building for Masochists. And those are the main places to find me. I mean, I'm on other social media, but the main purpose of those just sort of point back to either my webpage or my Twitter, because those are the places I am the most. And you can find my books at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or Bookshop, or anywhere else you buy books. You can find me in person, theoretically, in October at ArmadilloCon in Austin, where I'm going to be one of the special guests there this year. And you could also probably find me at Worldcon in December, because Worldbuilding for Masochists is, in fact, nominated for a Hugo. So we're going to be there, and we're going to be celebrating regardless of whether we win or not, because we're ridiculously excited about the fact that we have been nominated.
Yeah, that's very cool. Yes, very cool. And hopefully I'll see you then at Worldcon in December, because I'm planning on being there as well. So everybody, that's The Velocity of Revolution. Go out, buy it, read it, and review it as well. Reviews are always helpful. Like I said, I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was a unique take on fantasy and a fantasy world. And I also look forward to seeing more from Meridane from you. So everybody pre-order The Unexpected Journey from Maresca as well, while you're ordering The Last City of Revolution.
Just buy all the books. Just buy them all.
Just buy them all.
I just assume save yourself the time and buy them all.
I mean, I just assume everybody has the other 12 books already. I mean, I do.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for being here and chatting with us and drinking with us. And like I said,
thank you for having me.
Yeah, I hope I see you in the future at cons and elsewhere. Okay, so
all right.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you for our next Drinking with Authors.